All right. Good evening. I'm Cedric Parker, president of the Yearlings Club. And on behalf of the officers and the members of the Yearlings Club, we want to welcome you to the U of L Yearlings Club Forum Series, the series on Black History Month program. The forum in the series has celebrated the history and the heritage of African Americans since the programs began. And we're pleased to host our panel today. And we look forward to an engaging and informative program. Again, we welcome you, and it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Dawson Edwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid, and good afternoon, evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our February Black History Month Yearlings Club Forum Series. I am Cherie Dawson Edwards. I am the Associate Dean for Diversity Engagement, Culture, and Climate in the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of Louisville. So we are excited to have a full panel today of various experts and things related to Black history and achievement. And so we're going to spend some time today talking to them. I have some questions as usual to ask them. And then of course, we invite you all in the chat or the Q&A to post any questions that you may have for our panelists as well. So I'm going to open up by reading the bios of our distinguished panel today. Our first panelist is Sydney Finley of Louisville, Kentucky, is a member of the McConnell Scholar Class of 2023 at the University of Louisville, where she plans to studied biology and political science. She is a recipient of the Woodford R. Porter Scholarship and the Zeta Phi Beta Amica, I should have pronounced that, Amica Scholarship. She is a 2019 graduate from DuPont Manual High School, where she was a member of the Black Student Union, the Intersectionality Board, National Honor Society, and Key Club. She worked as a youth development specialist at the St. Vincent de Paul Family Success Center. She graduated in the top 10 of her high school class and maintained honor roll for all 4 years of high school. Thank you for joining us, Sydney. Our next panelist is Reverend L. Clark Williams, a native of Lexington, Kentucky, and ordained minister at Shiloh Baptist Church, where he currently serves as the director of ministry, overseeing and coordinating the work of the church's 39 ministries. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting from the University of Kentucky, a Juris Doctor degree from the Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville, and a Master of Theology degree from Campbellsville University. Clark has served as the president of Operation Turnout, an organization that provides voter education through local, state, and federal candidate forums since it was founded in 2010. He has also served as the chairman of the People's Campaign, a grassroots political action committee since its founding in 2015. Mr. Williams currently writes opinion columns on topics involving faith, politics, and social justice that appear in the Lexington Herald Leader and Louisville Courier Journal. He also serves as the political commentator for Key Conversations Radio that is broadcasted on WBTF, The Beat 107.9 FM, and WUKY 91.3 FM. Previously, Clark wrote a financial column for the Key News Journal entitled Our Money Matters. Our third panelist is Ramona Dallum-Lindsay. Ramona Dallum-Lindsay is a senior program officer, primarily responsible for the Community Foundation of Louisville's project strengthening leaders, artists, and entrepreneurs, as well as responding to timely community needs. She joined the Community Foundation of Louisville in July 2017 as a member of the Mission and Impact team. As a practicing visual artist, Ramona's artist practice and visionary background equip her to think outside traditional processes to coordinate, design, develop, and implement and manage foundation programs. She is the lead program officer working with specific philanthropic donors to implement community-based initiatives around repurposing vacant land in historic African-American neighborhoods and food security. Through her work, she is developing participatory grant-making processes, inviting those most impacted by grant funding to play a significant role in determining who receives funding. Ramona began her career in retail banking before transitioning into public education and nonprofit work. She obtained a BS in Business Administration from Florida A&M University and an MAT in Elementary Education from Spalding University. Ramona is a Louisville native with a mixed media textile practice and the mother of 2 children, Zachary and Faith. Our final panelist is Raul Cunningham. Began his civil rights activities when he joined the Louisville NAACP Youth Council in 1957 at the age of 14. As college students across the South began to sit in and protest to end segregation, there was a growing interest to tackle segregation in Louisville. With no Black college in Louisville, Cunningham and others persuaded the adult NAACP branch to permit high school students to march instead. In January of 1961, the NAACP Youth Council and the Congress of Racial Equality started demonstrating in downtown Louisville. The demonstrations, along with negotiations and economic boycott and voter participation, ended segregation in Louisville. As a Howard University student, Cunningham continued his civil rights activities by affiliating with the college chapter of the NAACP and Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, organized the university's first Young Democratic Club, and volunteered for the 1963 March on Washington. Upon his return to Louisville, Cunningham managed a successful campaign to elect Georgia Davis Powers as the first African American and first woman to the Kentucky Senate. His professional achievements include Senior Assistant for Legislation and Community Relations for U.S. Senator Walter D. Huddleston for over 12 years. He was appointed by 2 governors as Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Personnel, where he directed the affirmative action plan for the state. In 2000, Raul joined the national staff of the NAACP in the Voter Empowerment Program as a state and regional coordinator. In 2002, he was named National Deputy Director of the program. Mr. Cunningham was elected president of the Louisville branch NAACP in 2004 and the president of the Kentucky State Conference of the NAACP in 2014. He currently serves on the national board of the NAACP. He serves on the Kentucky Advisory Committee for Help America Vote, and was inducted into the Kentucky Civil Rights Hall of Fame in 2003. He was awarded the 2006 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Award by the City of Louisville, and in 2015 was awarded the Honorary Doctor of Humanities degree from Simmons College of Kentucky. Well, you all are a very distinguished panel. I'm out of breath reading about how accomplished you all are. So I am sure we are going to have an enriching conversation today to talk about the different topics in your expertise and your experience. So we're going to start with Ramona, if that is okay. And then I'll just kind of go through the panel as we see fit. So Ramona, in 2017, you participated in a year-long public discussion on the concept of redlining with West Louisville residents. The practice led to disinvestment in the red neighborhoods populated largely by people of color. In turn, generations of families were prevented from having equal access to financial tools necessary to buy and maintain property and homes. In Louisville, redline areas of the city sat with neighborhoods that still struggle with poverty, blight, and crime today. So our question for you is, can you briefly discuss redlining and its impact on economic development in the Black community, and describe any efforts underway through public or private partnerships to address the disinvestment in West Louisville?
Certainly, Dr. Dawson Edwards, I'll be happy to do that. But first, I want to acknowledge that Gina Dunlap has started this work in 2017, and she was scheduled to be your panelist here today to share some of that work and some of the impacts of redlining now, and how the city and those who care about people who have been impacted by redlining and other systems. She had a family emergency today, and so I am stepping in to help share some of her information. So I am going to share my screen briefly. Gina has prepared some information I think that can help guide our discussions. And if you guys could give me a thumbs up if you see the screen, that'd be great. All right, wonderful. So when we talk about redlining, and as you mentioned in your introduction, Dr. Dawson Edwards, redlining impacted Black families' abilities to purchase homes. And as we all know, real estate and home ownership is a key tool to wealth generation. And in this first slide is really talking about how that has impacted those neighborhoods, not only in Louisville, but nationwide. Dr. Andre Perry is with the Brookings Institute. I did research with the Brookings Institute, looking at how do we value Black lives and the property in America's Black cities. Um, Dr. Perry will be doing some very intense and specific work looking at the numbers here in Louisville. But this quote talks about the value of homes in Black cities. So homes of similar quality in neighborhoods with similar amenities are valued or assessed at 23% less, an average of $48,000 per home on average, which if you look at that cumulatively is about $156 billion in losses in majority Black neighborhoods compared to those with very few or no Black residents. And for more information about redlining and the specific neighborhoods that were impacted by redlining in Louisville, there was the 2017 report, which is also online, Redlining Louisville, Racial Capitalism and Real Estate, is still available online, and that research was done by Josh Poe. When you look at, when you start talking about wealth and you think about Black income, these are some data for Louisville. 26% of Louisville families are headed by Black people. Only 28% of those Black headed households are actually in Louisville's West End. And 11% of Black headed households earning six figures or more in Louisville, they choose to live in the West End. When we look at the impact of redlining on wealth, currently, we see that there are a greater number of mortgage denials in neighborhoods that were currently redlined. Homeowners' auto insurance rates tend to be significantly higher in those areas. Appraisals and property assessments are generally lower, and that's also referring to Dr. Perry's work mentioned in the previous slide. There tends to be a greater number of Section 8 vouchers that are issued for areas that were formerly redlined neighborhoods. You see payday lenders and check cashing organizations where there are businesses where they're charging predatory interest rates of 500%. In some cases, you see more of those in those neighborhoods. There's significant grocery store divestment. You see that with the in the West End with the very small number of grocery stores that are offering high quality, healthy food. And you see a lack of high-speed internet. So also adding towards the digital divide. This next slide, the map on your left, actually visually shows the digital divide. The dark blue areas are neighborhoods that do not have access to high-speed internet. As the colors get lighter, the greater the access to internet. You will notice that the dark blue areas are primarily in Louisville's West End and the Southwest areas of our city. The table shows the amount of Black led households in the West End. And you will notice that Russell has the highest number of Black-led households in the West End. And if you look at the amount of earnings in those neighborhoods, when you look at households that have earnings of $75,000 to $200,000 or more, you see that there is only 5.4% of the households in Russell fall into that category. And you'll see that none of those numbers surpass 15% of those households having household earnings above $75,000 to $200,000. This next slide is referring to a 2018 survey that was conducted by Louisville Metro, asking people who lived in Russell and Russell business owners some specific questions. And in this survey, it was identified that 83% of owner-occupied households in Russell were African American households, and 71% of those were female led. That is a counter narrative to what we hear about the welfare mothers. You hear these narratives that Black women are on welfare and jobless and don't have homes. When you look at the data for Louisville and in Russell, that is not true. Also, you look at who is investing in the Russell neighborhood. Predominantly 63% of the residential investors in Russell are African American men. Again, that is a counter narrative to what we hear about absentee landlords in this area. So it really makes us ask the question, what do we do to support the homeowners and the residential developers who are currently working and investing in the West End, specifically in Russell? So that brings me to the last slide, where we are really talking about how do we answer that question? What are we doing to answer that question? How are we supporting Black homeowners and business developers? There are several initiatives underway currently. One is LISC Louisville, Local Initiatives Support Group. This is a national organization that helps to build capital stacks to support development and investment for home ownership, entrepreneurship, can help bring national dollars into our local environment. LISC will be establishing an office here in Louisville, and they're currently looking for an executive director from within Louisville to manage that office, to work and partner with other institutions who are already doing the work to help with residential development and to close the wealth gap and looking at entrepreneurship and business development. The Community Development Network is a group of CDCs, community development corporations, that are working together to build the capacity of CDCs in the area to address the wealth gap in Louisville. A Path Forward was a document that was in response to not only the pandemic of 2020, which we're still experiencing now, and the calls for racial justice, but the leaders in the Path Forward listed some specific actions. One of those was, how do we build a pipeline or a path towards home ownership? So working with Rebound, the city, and many other partners, there's an initiative in place to create 100 homes on vacant, abandoned, or repurposed properties in Louisville's West End. The Plan Room at One West is looking to support minority-owned businesses that are focused on construction and construction-related industries. The Plan Room is established as a business accelerator focused on supporting those minority-owned businesses in the construction industry. In September of 2020, the mayor, through an executive order, created the Task Force on Equitable Procurement. And this task force is charged with working to close the community's wealth gap by supporting Black-owned, minority, female, and disabled-owned business enterprises through supplier diversity initiatives, particularly related to capital projects. It is planned or estimated that within the next 5 years, There will be $5 billion in capital infrastructure projects. And this task force is really looking at how can Black-owned, minority, female, and disabled-owned enterprises gain some of those contracts. And finally, we're looking at community land trust, and the city, Louisville Metro, has set aside $2.5 million to create a community land trust in both Smoketown, which will be led by Bates CDC, and in the Russell neighborhood, which will be led by Rebound. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to close that wealth gap that was created through systems, through redlining. So now we're looking at how do we create new systems to create support for Black and minority-owned business owners and those residential homeowners.
Thank you so much, and we really appreciate you stepping in to support Gina, and we certainly appreciate Gina Dunlap for finding someone to come in her place. So we appreciate you all both for that, and I have plenty of questions, especially related to narratives and counter narratives that hopefully we can get into when we get into the Q&A session. So thank you.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. So for our next panelist, Raul Cunningham, I want you to talk to us a little bit about where you see civil rights gains for African Americans. I know the other day our office, Diversity, Engagement, Culture, and Climate, hosted a program with Dr. George C. Wright, who gave us some, phenomenal information about the purpose of Black History Month and just his take on where progress has been made in civil rights and in racial justice for Black folks. But there's a lot of people out there, especially given 2020, that feel like it doesn't feel like much progress has been gained. So can you talk, to us about your perception of that? I mean, you've done this work for a long time and you've seen, a lot over the course of your service. So can you share your views on civil rights gains African Americans have made during the past 50 years and discuss current voter suppression efforts underway in Kentucky and across the nation? I believe you're muted. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you for having me to participate with you this afternoon. Gains have been made. As a matter of fact, yesterday was the 60th year of the first arrest of us as students in the civil rights movement of 1961. Since that time of my active involvement, you can't question the gains have been made. Some gains have been made. When you look at, say, Congress itself, currently there are 58 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. Several years ago, in my time, there were only 3 members. Gains, yes. You can look not only at the election of Barack Obama, but the election of Vice President Harris. Gains have been made. You can look at Louisville, at the number of Black judges that we now have. Gains have been made. Now, with those gains came some pushback. And we are currently engaged in a lot of pushback. We thought in 1954 with the Supreme Court decision on Brown versus Board of Education, look at what is today. Louisville is now looking at going back to a system that is currently being discussed that we know will resegregate our schools. Will that be bad? Will it be good? Gains. When you look at voter suppression, about 25 to 28 states now have legislation that will suppress the Black vote. In Kentucky, we had the strictest voter pattern or laws that restricted citizens from voting with convicted felons not being able to vote. In December, Governor Beshear changed that, but that was by executive order. That can be changed by the next governor if he wants to repeal it. Therefore, we need to be working toward legislation that will amend the Constitution and allow former felons to be able to vote. Last year's election, with the emergency powers enacted by the emergency powers that were acted on by the governor and the Secretary of State, we had for the first time early voting, mail-in voting. The legislature is now considering repealing some of that progress that was made in this year's election. So we need to be very careful. We need to watch that legislation. Also this week, another bill was introduced, House Bill 309, which we were all supporting, that would but give the newly created Civilian Police Review Board subpoena powers. That we need. But the legislation that has been introduced not only could give subpoena power, but, and I'm nonpartisan at this point, the Republican legislature is considering making the elections in Louisville for mayor nonpartisan. So they're going to give it on one hand and take it away on the other hand. These are issues that we have got to pay strict attention to and not allow or not support legislation that will suppress the vote, as it's been going on in other states. You can only look at the seizure of the Capitol, and everyone realized that if that had been African Americans, many lives would have been lost. So while we have made progress, and we must continue to work for progress, the NAACP has filed suit, and we're filing more suits in the upcoming months to allow or to abolish voter suppression. So, yes, we made gains, but yes, we still have a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you actually led into my next question for Sydney Finley. So Sydney, as we thought about the panel and the discussion that we wanted to have this month, we felt like it was very important to hear the voices of younger folks, right? Not just now. People are talking about, like, we think back to, like, I know the new movie's out with like Fred Hampton, and people are like, I didn't know he was 21. People don't realize how young Martin Luther King Jr. was, like how young Raul Cunningham was when he started doing this work. And so I think we see these icon, figures, and we forget how young they were. And then it's so interesting that sometimes it feels like we're not trying to listen to our young people now, even though we can think back on, in revelry of the young folks that, led this work so long ago. So Sydney, given, some of the things that Mr. Cunningham just mentioned, particularly when you think about January 6th, and how, as a nation, as a world, we watched the rioters attempt to overthrow the Electoral College vote by storming the Capitol. We know all of the context and things that occurred before that happened that led up to it. And then we also recently saw the twice impeached former president acquitted of charges to incite a riot. So my question for you today is, as a political science major, a scholar, and a student, can you share your views on the events? If we could talk about, the last 5 years or but can you talk to us a little bit since the elections, the last 3 months, and, discuss how you see what's causing the growing divisiveness within our country, and how to, from your view as a younger person, what does this feel like to you, and what are your perceptions of it?
Definitely. And I think even like the introduction to this question, I just watched Judas and the Black Messiah last night, actually. And my younger siblings, they didn't know that he was 21. And it was just so I wasn't surprised that I had to like explain to them, like, oh, well, a lot of civil rights activists and advocates were around that age at the time. And that also goes to show, the FBI and CIA, how adamant they were about murdering him. Just shows how powerful young voices are, even today, with like Black Lives Matter activists. Not surprisingly, but like all of a sudden, like, I can't remember his name, but it was a carjacking, I think, is what was told in the news, but everyone was like, okay, that's kind of suspicious. So just stuff like that, and it's still happening today. But even that in itself is empowering for young people, at least from my perspective, just knowing that our voices mean something. And even seeing that within voting, a lot of young people are working with voting advocacy campaigns and doing more of like that grassroots organization to get younger people to the polls and to vote. But I guess 3 of the main things that I think contributed to the insurrection at the Capitol, but then also Donald Trump being acquitted of inciting the riot, were kind of the pervasiveness of agreeing to disagree, and how that's kind of pushed aside a lot of the issues that we need to be focusing on today. Also, the myth of American exceptionalism, and sort of like that lost cause mentality of like the Confederate South. And then also, with Mr. Cunningham, you mentioned this, after the election of President Barack Obama, a lot of people thought we were entering this sort of like post-racial society, and that racism no longer existed because we had a Black president. Even now with the election of Vice President Harris, people are saying, oh, well, now we have a Black woman in office as well. Racism doesn't exist anymore. Stop complaining, essentially, is what Black people are being told. And that's just not the case. But I guess first, starting with agreeing to disagree, just that in itself is a tactic used to protect someone's personal beliefs and their morals and their value system and stuff like that. And it's essentially keeping one's ego intact. And I think egos get in the way of having productive conversations, especially surrounding politics and race. And that's why we don't see any movement anywhere, because people are so concerned of keeping their egos intact that we can't have genuine, honest conversations about issues that are real and that are affecting people's livelihoods. And one of the things that I think we've been agreeing to disagree on for too long is the fact that our nation was founded upon racism. A lot of people, which this even goes into like American exceptionalism, right? People kind of other the United States away from the exploitation of Native Americans and African people who were enslaved and brought over to the US and then exploited through slavery. And now we have the United States we see today. A lot of people ignore that past, and it's all about like grit and hard work and freedom and liberty. But how can you say those things when we weren't founded on that? So a lot of people who reject that tend to reject the notion of, for example, racism, and then a lot of more progressive political ideologies, which is just perpetuating that divide that we see along racial and political lines even further, because like I mentioned earlier, the ego is trying to stay intact. So without kind of addressing that, we can't really get anywhere. And then, yes, thank you, Miss Ramona. She said that in the chat. Thank you for that. And then also, we just touching more on the fact of kind of the United States failure to reckon with its history. It's just reasonably, like, I ask myself this every day. How can someone reject the fact that racism is systemic when literally history tells us that it was? And that just goes to show, again, it's an ego thing, and just failing to, it's kind of like, what is it, selective hearing, selective listening, something like that. So yeah, and just going on into my next point, that rejection of truth is is showing itself through American exceptionalism. I think early notions of American exceptionalism, like the US is the shining city on a hill, and we're a beacon of liberty for all, and we can solve like any problem that exists on like the international standpoint. But American exceptionalism in itself is making it difficult for anyone to critique America. And I think that's also what's contributing to a lot of the divisiveness we're seeing today, because you have people who say that are super patriotic for their country, but then if you have people who want to critique their country and even be patriotic at the same time, they're seen as traitors or ungrateful for what America has to offer. And I think, for example, we see this when people are like, oh, like if you don't like it here, then go somewhere else. That's something that came up a lot during Trump's candidacy and the whole build the wall thing. And then also with like the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and if you support BLM, you're a terrorist, which people have actually told me, not surprisingly, but and or if you critique the United States, you're a coward or a traitor. And just social justice groups in general being used as scapegoats for the country's problems and the divisiveness that we see today, instead of actually addressing the reason behind the divisiveness and why social justice and social advocacy groups feel the need to exist in the first place. And then lastly, just talking more about the myth of the post-racial society. Like I mentioned, after President Barack Obama was elected, a lot of people just walked. It was like this, they just realized that the sky was blue, and they're like, oh, like racism doesn't exist. Like, we're all good. Like, we can all party in the streets now. And that's just not the case. I think especially just like talking more about my background, like I would consider myself like a middle class person, and a lot of people, I didn't fit the stereotypical mold of a Black person who is from a single mother household who lived in the quote unquote hood and went to a terrible school and didn't have good grades or whatever. And then even if I did fit that mold, the fact that I excelled academically was like an exception to like some sort of rule or something, which obviously like is so far from the truth. Like just basically post-racialism made it okay for people to view specifically the Black community, but just communities of color in general, as monolithic and just like really like single level, super like shallow, and just not having any sort of like difference or heterogeneity at all. And that's what's contributing to like the ignorance that we're seeing today. It's not that it all of a sudden came out of nowhere. It's just more people are emboldened and feel like it's okay to show those perspectives. And it's also getting caught on camera with their, insurgence of social media as well. But we're just seeing a lot of racial and political conflict right now. And I think that's something else that just contributes to that, because a lot of people, it's kind of like colorblind racism. You see people who are like, oh, like we're all the same. So like if there's a problem, it's just because that's the way it is. And race doesn't have anything to do with it, stuff like that. And just the rejection of that in itself is just what's contributing to the fact that we can't get anywhere. It's kind of a full circle. You have people saying, oh, like racism doesn't exist. That also manifests itself in like the rejection of our country's history. And then you have people trying to bring that up, and then they're viewed as like traitors and terrorists and people who hate their country. So then they're ostracized or labeled some sort of negative label. And then everybody hops on that bandwagon and just disregards them as a whole. So yeah, that's how I would answer the question.
Thank you very much, Sydney. And then our final panelist, Reverend Clark Williams. I'm going to kind of ask you a similar question that I asked Mr. Cunningham, but a little bit different. So first, let me just read this little tidbit. In an analysis by the Brennan Center for Justice, in 2020 alone, 106 bills have been introduced in 28 states, including 17 under complete GOP control, where passage is more likely to undermine access to the franchise. According to the Brennan Center's report, these proposals primarily seek to, 1, limit mail voting access, 2, impose stricter voter ID requirements, 3, limit successful pro-voter registration policies, and 4, enable more aggressive voter roll purges. So my question for you is, can you please describe the role the People's Campaign used to, please describe what the strategy the People's Campaign used to assist with increasing voter turnout during the 2020 election in Kentucky and across the region. In 2020 and 2021 election cycles in Georgia, the number of registered voters increased by 100,000 voters between the November and January, between the November elections and the January runoffs. Can those efforts be replicated in other states like Kentucky? What are your thoughts on that?
Again, thanks for having me, sitting here listening and learning. The People's Campaign in a nutshell, one thing that we do that is different than a lot of the work that happens in our communities. It's starting to happen more and more, but we have shied away as a Black community generally from the notion of being quote unquote political. We kind of flirt with being political sometimes, but so many otherwise very, very engaged people will tell you very quickly, well, I don't get into politics. I'm not interested in that. I don't try to fool with politics at all. It's got such a negative connotation, and it has earned that connotation, but politics is a tool. And it, like any tool, it can be used in the manner that is either positive or negative. The best definition of politics is that politics, and it was a definition from back in the 1930s, a gentleman by the name of Harold Laswell was a political and social commentator. He defined politics by the title of his book. His book was Politics: Who Gets What, When, and How. That's what politics is. And so even in the church context, I start off sometimes when I'm just speaking to people, not about the church becoming a political organization, but who here is would consider themselves a person that is involved or interested in politics. And oftentimes nobody really wants to own up to that. I'll say, who is concerned about who gets what, when, and how? then everybody is interested in that. And I said, well, that really is the best definition of what politics really is. So therefore, we all, if we're Christians in our in our faith, we all should be engaged in some way. Now, with that being said, at the People's Campaign, we actually did something that wasn't done a lot in across the country this year because of COVID, but we did it in a very responsible way, and had a lot of success with it here in Kentucky. We did do, there's various ways you can go into communities and talk to people about voting. One of those ways is canvassing. And canvassing was not really deemed to be the most appropriate thing to do in 2020 because of COVID. But there is a level of canvassing or something kind of between canvassing and dropping off literature at people's doors that we engaged in as far as a field operation. And so, making a long story short, we delivered cards to 137,000 Kentucky households during the general election cycle from July through the election, and it had all that information on it, much of which what people just didn't know. It had some, and we're political. We endorsed in the Senate race. We endorsed in other races. So on one hand, most of the cards we distributed had some information about the candidates on it. But on the other side, it had all that other information that was brand new to everybody, like where they can vote and what time and all of that stuff that even if you vote every year, you didn't know this stuff unless you went out and found it or were able to connect in with something so you could be clear on a lot of those details. And so in Louisville, Jefferson County, I think we did about 40,000 doors. Fayette County, we did about 70. And in Fayette County, particularly on the north side, where we were very concentrated, where a larger portion of our minority population is, this is not a political discussion per se, but these are just results that took place. As far as counties that swung the furthest away from Donald Trump in 2020, Lexington, Fayette County, metropolitan areas that swung furthest away from Donald Trump. Lexington, Fayette Metro had the fifth biggest swing nationally away from Donald Trump. And one of the ways that was done, we were out there getting the information in people's hands, socially distancing and talking to people. And you will never see enough commercials. They can never, and I produce commercials for political stuff, but you will never be able to produce enough commercials that people will see. As Mr. Cunningham, I can tell you, that will replace talking to people one-on-one, explaining to them what they need to know about voting, and explaining to them the importance and the urgency of the issues. And so that's a crucial piece. That's what we did here. We also, though, did do some digital messaging down in Georgia in the Warnock and Ossoff races, really trying to connect with people who voted in the general election, but didn't have a history of voting in those runoff elections that they have down in Georgia. And so we're engaged down there as well with about 117,000 voters down in Georgia as well, digitally.
Thank you. I was hoping you were going to mention the Warnock race. I was actually in Georgia. My parents live in Macon, Georgia. So for Christmas, we were safely down there with them for a week. And I was just so amazed that, you were talking about like how talking to people, is more effective. And I'm glad, because the ads that they were showing, I've never seen those type of attack ads in Kentucky. They were awful. I mean, they were really awful. And, Sydney talks about, how people believe when they see Black folks advance that, well, we're post-racial. Oh, but every racial trope you could put into a campaign attack ad was done against Warnock, and it was absolutely disgusting. So I am glad that you and other people were down there talking to people, or you were doing some kind of communication with folks, because it really felt real. It really did not feel like 2021. And I agree, Mr. Cunningham, that we've certainly made gains. But I can tell you that in my almost 45 years of existence, I've never seen the kind of attack ad that I saw in January in Georgia for that week I was there. I mean, I almost had to turn the TV off because it was that bad. I mean, my kids, I have a 14-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. They even noticed. They were like, "Why are they making this black man, seem so evil and dangerous and criminal?" And it was terrible. So I was very happy that was the result in Georgia, given the kind of negativity that was surrounding that runoff, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So I want to invite the audience. We actually have a pretty good crowd out there this evening to ask any questions that they may have in the chat feature. But I also want to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to each other if there was anything that someone spoke about or mentioned that you have a comment or question about. I'd invite you all to do that. If not, I always have a bazillion questions, so I can certainly ask some questions as well. Do any of the panelists have any feedback or comments? Ramona?
Yes, I wanted to respond to some of what Sydney raised about history and how white dominant culture wants to rewrite history and look at our history through a white lens instead of through an actual realistic historical lens. And I like James Baldwin, and I'm reading more of his quotes lately, but there's a quote that says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And I think when we have to really look at what has happened in our history, the data like we've gotten from the redlining that was uncovered by a white researcher, but we had to face that system that was put in place before we could start trying to figure out how do we unravel that. And I think that we have to continuously, as advocates, force people to face those uncomfortable things. And I know it's not always easy. I know it's not always safe, but I think that's one of the things that we have to be able to do. And I turned 50 last October. And so I know that I'm at that place where I have to intentionally support our younger advocates and to give them the platform, the resources, the networks that they need to actually provoke and make change and open eyes. And I think that it's more people in my generation. I think we have to really step up and accept that responsibility as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? We do have some questions coming up in the chat. So the first one is, where do you see Louisville in regards to Breonna Taylor? Will there be justice? Anybody want to tackle that question?
I'll jump in. I definitely want to talk about that. I think one of the things that appears to be lost in the Breonna Taylor tragedy and then travesty is that the Commonwealth attorney had a job to do in this particular instance. But he charged Kenneth Walker with a crime, okay? He charged Kenneth Walker with a crime and then said that he had a conflict of interest because he'd already charged Walker, so therefore he could not charge the police. As soon as Daniel Cameron jumped up so quickly to take the case, within a week or two, the charges were dropped against Kenneth Walker. And we've never really talked to the Commonwealth attorney again about why he has not brought any charges. So that's a piece of this that needs to be in the public discourse. And then also, one of the things we've got to always be mindful of in instances like this is prosecutors and judges are elected people. And we've got to act with that in mind. Daniel Cameron wasn't on the ballot immediately, so we can't have short memories either. If we don't like what prosecutors and judges are doing, they need to really feel the pressure that in 2023 or what have you, if I'm going to be on the ballot, then people are going to remember this and people will organize around races that pertain to prosecutors and judges. Typically, you don't have that level of political organizing around prosecutorial and judicial races. But in Louisville, Kentucky, in so many other communities across this country where judges and prosecutors, and in this case, prosecutors, haven't done their job, then you've got to get more political. You've got to focus on the real actors in the space. It's not directly the mayor, it's not directly others, it's the prosecutors. And you've got to organize politically around that.
Reverend Williams,
Yes, sir.
I would like to add the NAACP Louisville branch, week before last, sent a letter to the Commonwealth's attorney asking him to be one to intervene,
Great.
and asked him to tell us why, if he does not, to explain why, and we will make that public. But we
Great.
did go directly to him
Great.
to ask him that.
I'm glad to hear that, and we all need to hear that loud and clear. The NAACP has asked the absolutely right question, and all of us need to have our ears open and our eyes open to see what the response is. And if it's not the right response, we need to be very, very intentional about how we respond to that. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Anyone else? You think that,
If
I don't want to, go ahead.
I'd like to also, one aspect that I think we have that's not directly germane, but we need to ask everyone to get the vaccination. And on that, I'm gonna leave that alone and to get back to the subject. But I think it's important that we encourage our community to get the vaccination.
Thank you. So the next question is about House Bill 309. It says, what should be the strategy for addressing House Bill 309? Yes, we want subpoena power for the Civilian Review Board, but at what sacrifice? With that said, though, with the Republicans having a supermajority, don't you feel they are going to do whatever they want and can do with our or without our support? Any thoughts about that?
Yes, they can. They've got the supermajority. We have talked to some of the African American legislators and trying to develop a strategy of how or can we live with this bill, House Bill 309, or do we encourage, can we find ways to get around to ensure subpoena powers? That's the main purpose. But is it a poison pill that we have to accept the change in our elections in order to get that?
Thank you.
So, can I ask a follow up on that to Ms. Cunningham? Now, the poison pill, are we talking about the elections shifting to nonpartisan?
Yes.
Is that what we're saying?
Yes.
That is something to really be mindful of. One of the things we have here in Lexington, we have nonpartisan city races.
You do.
And one of the things that we see over and over again that requires a lot of effort, good, bad, or indifferent, once you take D's and R's away from names, that should be beneficial to the discourse. But a lot of times we don't do enough homework to really see where people stand on the issues without diverting to or reverting to a partisan line, to where it requires a lot more education and a lot more discipline to make sure you really understand, who you're voting for when you have these nonpartisan elections. So please just be alerted to that. They're not inherently bad, but there are a lot of bad outcomes that happen because people aren't informed enough when they're not partisan.
And the other thing, Reverend Williams, what they have proposed is to only make the mayor's race partisan and leave the city council race, make the mayor's race nonpartisan and leave the city council race as partisan. That's also in the bill.
And certainly there's a reason why they want to do that.
Sure, we know
That
what it
reason
is.
is partisan.
We have one of our guests who wanted to ask a question, so we've added him to the meet or the webinar. So Raymond Burst, you had your hand up. Did you have a question or a comment?
I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, okay. It showed up in the participant list, so I
Well, raise
apologize.
it.
Okay, well, I apologize. It showed up. I didn't want to miss out on anything. All right, so we can remove him from the webinar if that's possible. Thank you. Okay, so sorry everyone. I was trying to manage that piece of the webinar and also trying to manage the panelist stuff as well. So any other commentary? There aren't any more questions in the chat, but I would like to revisit a couple of things if that's possible. Ramona, when you were speaking about redlining and you were talking about narratives of Black women and, like the welfare mom or the welfare queen. And you also talked about narratives that people have about Black men. And I just wonder, and I know that you do a lot of different, work in different kind of spaces in our community, and I appreciate you for that for sure. But, what are the counter narratives that we need to push to rewrite all the negative narratives that we see? I think it just kind of resonates with me when someone brings that up. So when we talk about the history, for instance, of redlining and the truth of what has happened and what's led to some of the issues that we see today, oftentimes you don't want to talk about the truth. They don't want to do the truth telling part. They just want to move it to, well, everything's fine, and it's not fine. And so how do we continue to push the counter narratives to make sure that not just the folks on this particular webinar as panelists or attendees, but like broader Louisvillians understand how the systems and structures were set in place in motion years ago and how they're impacting us today. So I don't know, can you just talk a little bit more about the narratives and counter narratives that we need to be combating narratives, but then pushing the counter narratives?
I think that we have to be, Black people have to be more in control of our narratives and the stories that we're telling and in the spaces where we're in. And I believe that when we take more control of the media and the stories that are coming through the media, and we're challenged the narratives that are inaccurate that we're hearing in the media, and we correct them, that we call people to task on who want to promote these inaccurate narratives. It's our responsibility to do that. And again, when we talk about, when I spoke earlier about supporting young people, that's one way to counter those narratives, that we have to give people platforms and spaces so they can begin to shift and tell a more accurate story of who we are and what we represent. I work with the Community Foundation of Louisville, and philanthropy has historically asked people to tell these deficit-based narratives of their community. Like, how bad is it in your community? So, and if you tell a bad enough story, a heart-wrenching story, you're more likely to get funding. It's part of our responsibility as people in philanthropy who have been requiring those stories for funding to to change ourselves, to look at our own operational strategies and really look at, are we building up communities, and how do we work within those communities to identify the assets, the strengths, and provide the resources so those people who are already closest to the work, closest to the issues, who already have the relationships with the community, are further enabled to do what they need to do to develop those communities and to reach those aspirations and those goals within community. The Community Foundation of Louisville is actively doing that now through our Fund for Louisville Racial Justice Cohort. We've worked with 15 members of the Black community to help us look at what were the barriers we were creating to funding, and then correcting those barriers, and then inviting members of the Black community to be members, to be active participants in the decision-making process for where that funding goes, and how do we support systems level change that corrects inequity, racial inequity in our community. And I think it's going to take more organizations, predominantly white-led institutions, to actively act on correcting the things that they have put in place that are leading towards racial inequity.
Thank you. And actually, there's the question in the chat is actually for you, Ramona. It says, when the mayor was pressed to explain why redlining is taking place in Louisville, his response was, if you can prove that redlining is occurring in our city, I will address it. In your data or research or experiences, Ramona, do you believe that redlining can be proven today? Or has it been?
I'm going to answer from my viewpoint because I don't know the specific answer. That was probably more of a Gina question. But if you look at appraisals for home purchases, it's just a personal example. I was looking to purchase a home in the West End, and it was a white developer who was flipping the home. I had structural engineers, home inspectors tell me that there was significant work that needed to be done on this house, and I refused to buy it. But I got the appraisal for that home, and the white appraiser went way outside of the West End to find comps on that house, so it could appraise for like $250,000, and it was nowhere near that in value because of all the structural damage to it. But in my opinion, I think it was because it was a white developer in a Black community who had a white appraiser look at that home. And I have seen other homes in parts of the West End that should have been appraised at different rates, but they weren't because it was a Black developer who was offering that home for sale. So I don't have specific data, but I have experience that tells me that there's something going on with how we're looking at homes in the West End, and how those values are impacted based on who's doing the looking and who's doing the appraising and who's doing the selling.
Thank you. And I just want to note that I added a comment in the chat. So we realized that the flyer said that this program was running from 4 to 5. The Yearlings Club Forum series always runs from 4 to 5:30. So if the guest on the other side are thinking they don't have time to ask questions, and I just want to let them know that we do have a little bit more time if they do want to pose some questions in the chat. There is a question for all of the panelists, and it relates to what Raul Cunningham mentioned as it relates to the COVID vaccination. So if we can spend some time on that, it says, if time allows, can Reverend Williams and perhaps the other panelists talk about the disparities in COVID-19 vaccinations? What is the church doing? What is the NAACP doing? What should the Black leaders in Louisville be doing?
Let me, if I may, I could start off before Reverend Williams. If you go to the NAACP website, LOUNAACP.org, we have put on there a fact sheet that we are disseminating, telling telling the things or the facts about the vaccination. It's imperative that everyone get the facts, and we have gone to several sources, and that is on our webpage, and it's the fact sheet on the vaccination.
All of those kind of pieces are crucial. One of our churches in Lexington, one of the general practitioners, MDs, did a great webinar, Dr. J. Gilliam, and some of us are trying to disseminate that around just so folks can understand what to expect. It's really a matter of trust and access. On one hand, the access piece, as we have a limited number of places, particularly in urban areas based on population density. There are limited places we can go to get vaccine. And so access, transportation, et cetera, distance becomes a problem. And so we have one way, I guess, that some of the churches are trying to address that, particularly in Lexington, I believe in Louisville, and some churches are doing similar things, is we have partnered with the University of Kentucky. And so on a series of weekends, including Shiloh, where I'm at, we will be doing the first dose March the 6th, and we will be doing the second dose. I think this is the Moderna, so 4 weeks later on April the 3rd, that Saturday, for that same group of folks that need both doses. And so one of the things, so that's an access issue, bringing the vaccine into our communities. The trust issue, in similar fashion, a number of ministers I know over there as well as over here in other places, you know, as we're getting vaccinated. I saw Mr. Cunningham when he got vaccinated on social media. I think someone posted it. You know, we're making it known that we're doing this, you know, so we're trying to lead as best we can by example, or figuring that we can normalize the idea of getting the vaccine, given the disparity between our populations and the number of folks that have gotten vaccinated to this point. Just trying to do some things to increase the trust by showing by example that at least some of us believe this is okay or the right thing to do, and then also access by opening our doors in order for folks to be able to come into our churches and get the vaccination right there in the neighborhood.
Thank you. I'll chime in. I mean, I'm the moderator, not a panelist, but I think certainly access is a concern, and not even just, you know, I mean, not, of course, the things that you all are talking about are great, but I mean, even as someone, I currently don't qualify for the vaccine. College professors aren't considered teachers in Kentucky, and so we don't qualify. However, just perusing, you know, casually trying to figure out where I would go if I did, you know, it's one thing when your job, like JCBS, says, oh, this is what you need to do, and it tells you exactly what you need to do, where you need to go, and how you get there. But regular folks don't have that, you know, and that's why it is important for community-based groups and community members to help disseminate that information. Because, I think Paula in the chat said, there's a lot of folks who don't have the internet. Then Ramona said in her redlining presentation that there's a lot of folks that don't have access to high-speed internet, but all this information is available, supposedly available on the internet. And even when I go look for it, I have trouble trying to understand. I actually filled out a survey the other day on the state website and asked me these questions. And one of the questions was, do you work or volunteer in a public school? And I was like, I absolutely volunteer and I consult in public schools. And so I put yes. And they were like, oh, well, you're eligible for the vaccine. And I was like, but I'm not, and so it's just that communication and myth or disinformation that's out there that's contributing to the fact that people aren't necessarily getting it. So I applaud you all for your efforts to get the information and the vaccine out to the people. Does anyone else have any thoughts about COVID-19 vaccinations? There are a couple of other questions in the chat. What are your thoughts what are the thoughts regarding the digital divide and its effect on our children's educational attainment? This seems another example of redlining in disadvantaged areas. Ramona, you want to comment on that?
I would agree that it is an example of redlining disadvantage, and it's even been intensified when you think about NTI and families, non-traditional instruction, families who are being forced to do all of their educational instruction online. And if you don't have access to high-speed internet, it makes it extremely challenging for you to continue education for your child. And usually in the West End neighborhoods, the access is granted through libraries, but now libraries are not a place where we can go and get connectivity. So I believe I think it was Paula McCraney was asking that question about the digital divide as well. But it seems to me that there should be a more intentional focus at the government level to create the infrastructure so high-speed internet can go into those neighborhoods and those communities where it is currently not. And I don't know specifically how that looks, but I think that that should be a priority within our community when you look at that technology and digital access is a direct pathway to wealth attainment, educational attainment, and you just mentioned health access. So if you don't have those things, it's almost not like when I was growing up, if you didn't have a telephone, you were disadvantaged. If you do not have high-speed internet, you are put at a serious disadvantage. So I think that should be a priority of our elected leaders to figure out how do we get that infrastructure in place for everyone within our city.
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham, the chat has asked, can you speak to the federal voter rights bill?
Yes, I can. Being called now the John Lewis voter rights bill. It has passed the House of Representatives. We are hopeful that that the new Senate Majority Leader will bring it up for a vote on the Senate floor very shortly. The President has announced his support of the bill. All civil rights organizations are supporting the bill. As you may know, your senator, Senator McConnell, had put it in his graveyard for over a year. We'd like to, well, I won't say anyway, now that he is no longer the Senate majority, it can come up for a vote, and hopefully we will be able to pass the bill. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And then I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this question, and I just want to thank Paula McCraney for her great questions today and helping keeping this conversation going. But she's asked, can each panelist speak on your opinion about reparations?
I support him.
Anybody else? Do you have any, I'll ask the question. Does anybody have any idea for the framework for how that happens? You know, I think that we've talked about reparations, at least I've known, you know, I've talked about them for a long time. And I know that there are models in other countries where people have gotten reparations. There's models, you know, in this country, I suppose, in some ways, but like, how would that work? You know, how do we advocate for something and not necessarily everyone know what the framework for what that would look like, that we don't know what it looked like? Do you think having the framework out into the public, and not just for Black folks, but for other people to understand, will get other people to support reparations? So what do reparations look like in modern US?
Well, I support it, and I support, you know, the premise certainly of reparations. If you look at what this country has been and what it has done, certainly it has certainly gained so much on the backs of African Americans, and really has exploited. You know, we hear even a certain level of ignorance really around how long slavery took place. You know, well, it took place from 1619, let's say, to 1865. No, it didn't take place to 1865. We had black codes in place that essentially criminalized being Black, which allowed essentially people in the institutions in the South to continue to enslave people, and you know, keeping them in prison for life because they had a $5 fine for something that was almost unavoidable for them to do. And so we've got to come with that context to it. In terms of the absolute manner in which it's done, I mean, that's so debatable. There's so many ways that can be looked at. But I think it's absolutely something we should seek. However, we have to also understand that the white supremacy construct is such that it has never historically shown any propensity to relinquish anything that it didn't have to relinquish. And so that's still very much, I believe, you know, from one administration to the next, from one party to the next, you know, there are certain benefits, I think, from where we were to where we are now, even in the administration for sure. But that's not something that the white supremacist construct has been willing to relinquish. And a lot of it just comes from a lack of, it's a disregard, and it's a lack of empathy and an understanding or appreciation for just what has been done to Black people and people of color in general, but especially for this, we're talking about Black people that are of African descent, that are the descendants of slaves. There's no true appreciation for what has been done to us and done by us that has been a tremendous asset to this country.
And I would add to that, I don't know what that framework would look like. So I'm gonna start there. I don't know what that framework would look like. But when Reverend Williams talked about people not recognizing the impact of slavery, which was an economic institution, that they think that it just stopped and there's no impact today. NPR, WFPL just ran a radio series called The Reckoning, Facing the Legacy of Slavery in America, which actually looked at the impact of slavery in Kentucky, in Louisville specifically, and its current impact to today. And I think that we have to have more of those challenging conversations here in this city where we have to talk about it because if we don't recognize it, we can't change it. If we don't face it, we won't change it. And so I think there still has to be some more conversations, some removal of some ignorance, so we can move forward together. I think philanthropy has a role to play in those discussions, because when you really think about it, most of our philanthropic institutions are founded on wealth that was created during that economic system of slavery. So I think that that's something that our foundations and our philanthropic organizations at some point need to step into.
And I just echo what everyone said, but I also, in a class that I'm taking right now, we read Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay called The Case for Reparations. So I just highly recommend everyone, if you haven't read it yet, to read it.
Thank you. And then the last request is for Mr. Cunningham to talk to people about how they can become a member of the NAACP.
Thank you. If you go to our website, an app, it is on there where and how much. Our membership fees are only $30 per year. You get the Crisis magazine. I would encourage you to go to the website lounaa@naacp.org, and the information on join us, and click, and you can pay online, which is a new aspect of our drive. We would encourage everyone to join, and you're welcome. And we meet every third Monday. And right now we're meeting virtually, and that is online also.
Thank you very much. So this about ends our program. I knew after I read everyone's bios and introduced you, I knew that this would be an enriching hour and a half. And thank you, Sydney, for putting the name of the text in the chat for those who are interested. But again, thank you all for coming to and participating in the February Yearlings Club Forum series, co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, Office of Diversity, Engagement, Culture, and Climate. I hope that you all will enjoy this warmer weather that we are getting this week and unfreeze from our winter storm that we are recovering from, and be safe. And again, I want to reiterate the panel's discussion on vaccinations. Try to seek out that information and get the vaccine so we can move toward moving out of this world that we are stuck in right now. So thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Ramona. Thank you, Raul. Thank you, Reverend Clark Williams. And I also want to thank Celeste Lanier, who is our community engagement liaison, who works very hard to put together panels with topics that are engaging and relevant to our community and even beyond. Since the Yearlings Club Forum series has gone virtual, then we are able to expand well past the city limits. And while we certainly miss meeting in person at the Yearlings Club, we have appreciated everyone's adaptability to this environment. And so with that said, I will wish you a good evening, and hopefully we will see you all next month at our Yearlings Club Forum series then. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.